This is great for me because this is the first post-pandemic, the first since the start of the pandemic talk that I've given in person. And I know about you, but I've just had a belly full of Zoom, so it's great to be here. But what really pleases me is that I've been invited by Home on the Hill. It's great to be invited to talk at another hospital or at another university about, your thoughts and approaches, etc. But at the end of the day, it's patients and their families that we serve, and physicians and clinicians, other clinicians, should serve. So being recognised by families is particularly important to me. So thank you very much. That message, I think you're going to hear echoed through my talk. That families really are an important part of the system, and that they also can be a very effective part as individuals and as groups. And I know there's some people are maybe raising their eyebrows about that, but I really believe that. And that's why, one of the reasons why I've come here today. I'm going to just come around a little so I can see, yep. So here's the talk, the title of the talk I'm going to give, and it's going to be really in two parts. So one part is going to be talking about what individuals can do when their loved one isn't getting service, how they can advocate with the system. And I'm going to be speaking as an insider, as someone who's been on the other side. I've been the medical director or psychiatrist in chief of a hospital. I've been the attending psychiatrist in many of these situations. But I'm also going to talk about systematic advocacy, because I think the two really do need to go together. Okay? Yeah, so I'm going to do a little bit of an environmental scan about where we are, and then I'm going to talk to you about a little history of how we got there. So where are we now? It's a bit inane to say this, but of course we are in Canada, and it is 2021. It's no longer 2015. We're moving ahead, I hope. It's 2021. So what is Canada like in 2021? And I don't think we reflect enough what we are like compared to what other countries are like, because not everywhere is like Canada. And once you see that, you start being able to understand, I think, some of our values and some which may not be the best way of looking at things. So Canada, one thing is very clear, that Canada places a tremendous value in individualism. And I certainly support this. I doubt there'll be many people in the room who wouldn't. We're not as crazy about this as our cousins to the south, but we're much, much more individualistically focused than many other countries, many other advanced countries. So this really came home to me when I had the fortune to be able to visit mental health centers in Italy and in South America. And I was particularly struck in Buenos Aires, Argentina, meeting a group of social workers. And people who've been to Argentina will know that they really live their politics. Like, politics here is wishy-washy, sorry. But there's not much difference. I mean, we have a little bit of difference. But in Argentina, like, it's a society in turmoil, and these were union card-carrying members of the union, very left-wing, very strident, excellent social workers and advocates. And I was asking them, like, how can, like, the family are getting all this information about the patients. How can that be? And they were having difficulty with the question, and I thought it was lost in translation. You say que no habla bien español, but it wasn't that. At the end of the day, it was conceptual. They really couldn't get their mind around that information would be withheld from family. Because la familia, the family is the center. They're much less individualistic. Canada, thank goodness, is a country which really embraces rights. problem arises when different rights clash. So the right to, the right to liberty versus the right to treatment, the right to self-determination versus the right to treatment. We're seeing that played out now, of course, with vaccination. So which is a very interesting because it mirrors some of the issues in mental health care. And lastly, but I think we mustn't forget it, and I apologize to some of the people I've been speaking with because this has already come up. Canada is the land of mental health issues. I hear this term all the time. I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a physician, but the nurses I work with now sometimes start, and some of the doctors here talking about mental health issues. What the heck is that? Like, I deal in illness and people with severe illness. So there is a range of emotional, psychiatric, mental disorder and distress. But at one end, there are illnesses which are just like physical illnesses. They're incredibly severe. They've got a high mortality rate. Schizophrenia, 5 to 10%. Bipolar disorder, 10 to 15%. That's the manic depressive. Serious bipolar 1. These are serious illnesses which need to be treated properly and managed carefully. The mental health issues, the expanding of our concept of emotional distress and lumping it in with serious illnesses has actually caused problems. It's loaded up our emergency rooms so that people that come in with very serious problems can't get served, can't get a bed, and it's drawn away financial resources. I'm looking down the table at our politicians because it really has, from people with serious mental illness. So looking a little further. So what else is happening here? So we've talked a little bit about this. There are insufficient funds overall for mental illness, but it's really that serious. Thanks very much. Yeah, really that serious mental illness that I'm most concerned about. And there's constant threats to funding for people with serious mental illness. So it's again and again we're facing the battle and trying to get money. So this is why when people are discharged from hospital, they're not seen immediately. It's my colleagues are seeing so many people with emotional problems, anxiety about school marks, etc. And when somebody who's been in hospital for 2 weeks because of a suicidal episode is discharged, they might get an appointment for 4 weeks, for 8 weeks, for 2 months. They've been seen one day on a constant basis, been monitored, and then they don't get seen for 2 months. I mean, that's just appalling. The standard in the UK is within a week. But we need the resources dedicated to serious mental illness to do that. We have insufficient beds, so there's been a process of deinstitutionalization and placing services in the community, which I fully support, but we've just gone over the top. So it's a kind of a how low can you go? Nobody actually worked out how many beds we needed when we started deinstitutionalization. We just started cutting beds. Cut. We're all happy because the fiscal conservatives are delighted, but it ends up that you go too far. We've gone too far. So Canada, again, isn't as low as our neighbours to the south, but we're not chasing after American exceptionalism. Most European countries have way more beds, mental health beds, than Canada has. And we have insufficient residential placements, the insufficient of appropriate residential placements. That's why I'm delighted to be here talking today. But we, in addition to placements where people can come and go and don't need that much support, we need residences in the community with 24-hour nursing care and with doctors that are visiting regularly so that you don't need to make an appointment. you clap me, but don't clap me for saying what's obvious. I worked on this for years, trying to get people out of our hospital as they reduced the beds and serve them with an ACT team backing me, but without the appropriate residential placement, it's not going to work. So you put people into long-term care. That's not an appropriate place for somebody with a serious mental illness. And we do need more assertive community treatment. So it's not good enough that Joe doesn't come for his appointment and we just wait and we send him a letter. Somebody has to go and see Joe if he's got a severe illness where he doesn't recognize the need to follow up. But there's very little of that service. We need more of that service. That's what we need. Not so much more counsellors in university, etc. We need to make sure that we do this first and that it's done well. Okay, so how did we get here? So I'm gonna apologize. I'm a little bit of a history buff. I do believe in the importance of history and knowing how things happen so that you can decide what needs to be done. So I'm going to give you a quiz. Because my voice, you can already starting going, so I need a little rest. So does anybody recognize this individual? Nope, that's not the one. This is when I don't have my slides in front of me. So you won't recognize here, but Mr. Ross has mentioned. I did my medical training at Trinity College Dublin. And Trinity College it's just a wonderful place. So here it is. It's in the centre of Dublin. There's the hubbub outside. You come through the gate there, the main front gate, and you're into, I don't know how many acres, 100 acres of calm and tranquility and history, etc. And I was in and out of there for 6 years, most days, and I passed those two statues. For the first year or two, I didn't pay much attention, but then I sort of had a bit of time and I read the nameplates, Edmund Burke and Oliver Goldsmith. And Edmund Burke is an interesting character. So he's an Anglo-Irish politician and philosopher. And he was actually the first person to make this quote. I know George Santayana and many other people have made similar quotes, but we really do need to know our history or we just keep going round in circles. So now if I've got my back on track, this is the quiz. Does anybody know who this is? This is a wonderful woman. So this is Dorothea Dix, who was a nurse and an advocate for people with severe mental illnesses in the early 19th century. So starting 1820, 1830, Miss Dix recognized that people with severe mental illness were in the poor houses, were in the jails and on the streets. And she got together to lobby the eastern states to build psychiatric hospitals, asylums. And asylum, there's nothing wrong with asylum, it's become a bit pejorative, but asylum away from being beaten up in jail. And she did a great job. She came to Canada, visited Nova Scotia, and was influential in the development of asylums for the seriously mentally ill here. And this essentially is my hospital. This is the old London Psychiatric Hospital, built in the 1870s. It was on the site that I worked on. It was a new hospital built in the 60s, and we just vacated that site about 5 years ago, but the building still stands. So these were big, huge hospitals. London Psychiatric Hospital had 2,000 patients at its peak, 2,000. That was in the late 1950s. But they were always underfunded, these hospitals, and I'll not go into the whole details, but one interesting fact that just to bear in mind. So in the United States, many of the state hospitals for the mentally ill had which way do I say it? Had a lower per capita, it's a higher per capita number of patients to physicians in the outside environs. So, the outside in the community, you might have had one physician to 800 people. But in the hospital, there'd only be one physician to 1,500 patients in the hospital. So grossly underfunded. And institutions aren't great things anyway. Oh, I really do need my slides here. I do apologize. We'll get that to the next slide. Here, do people know who these two individuals are? You'll recognize one. Yeah, got Sigmund Freud, and the individual on the top is Emil Kraepelin. So Kraepelin is the father of biological psychiatry, I'd say, and Freud is the father of psychological psychiatry. So Freud was interested in psychoanalysis, developed psychoanalysis, and his practice was office-based in Vienna. So he dealt essentially with the worried well, essentially. Whereas Kraepelin always worked out of hospitals and was interested in dementia, schizophrenia, manic depressive illness. And he was the psychiatrist who first differentiated between schizophrenia and manic depressive disorder. So I show this slide because it really was the party in psychiatry which still holds today. So there are psychiatrists working in hospitals with seriously mentally ill. There are many working in the community as well with seriously mentally ill, but some who are just doing counselling and don't actually serve people with the most severe afflictions. And so this continues to divide psychiatry, I'd say. So I was saying that big institutions have problems, whether they're jails, residential schools, psychiatric hospitals, and there were a lot of problems in these underfunded hospitals. And this sociologist, Irving Goffman, wrote an excellent book on asylums, talked about the total institution. And so this was a sort of an intellectual trigger that came along in the late 50s, early 60s, just as antipsychotic medication was hitting the market. So the first effective antipsychotic medication was developed in 1953, and so by the 60s it was available to most hospitals. So that allowed a lot of people to be discharged. Then we had an interesting gentleman, Thomas Satz, a psychiatrist, who said, there's no such thing as mental illness. It's a construction, and several other people have said as well, it's a social construction. Well, tell that to the families who've had to deal with these terrible illnesses. In my view, Goffman, I think, was a serious intellectual, and I really respect his work. Satz, he was a charlatan, and no good. But he was allowed he was listened to because of the times. So this was the 60s, and it was more than just free sex and marijuana in the 60s. There were serious issues about civil rights. This is the March in Washington, Martin Luther King, and that had an influence elsewhere. This is my neck of the woods, Northern Ireland. So I grew up in the minority community in Northern Ireland. We did not have civil rights. We didn't have one man, one vote. We had a police force of 6,000 members, not one member of the minority community in that reserve police force. So you can imagine what that police force's job was. Anyway, this is Satz was in that time. And so people started to think and to look at individuals with mental illness as individuals whose rights weren't being protected. And all we needed to do was to shut down the asylums. That became a big move. And that's what happens. But nobody did studies to look at, preliminary studies to see how that could be done, what would be the best way. They rushed it forward. The services that were put in place by John F. Kennedy typically went to serve people with marital problems, etc., counselling, and people with serious mental illness were left on the streets. And so this is an image that's actually no longer shocks because we've all seen it. But when I used to show images like this in the 90s, people would recoil. But now we're just used to it. So we have accepted that we are, in my opinion, going to abandon people with illness to our streets. We're not going to provide the service or look after them. And there's just a cull in these people. If they're female, we're talking about that, they end up in being brought into prostitution. If they're male or female, they often end up with addiction, freeze to death, die of violence on the streets. It's a terrible situation. This is the homeless shelter in London, Ontario. It's overcrowded. It's full of people that have got serious mental illness. We ran an assertive community treatment team out of this shelter. When my colleague was off getting each of his hips done, I covered it, and it's like a hospital without clinical staff. Very difficult place. This is again London, Ontario. This is our emergency room. On a typical day, actually, the photograph appeared in the London Free Press. I think people know why there are 6 police cars there. So those are so-called mental health patients that have been brought in, and the police have to wait until they are finally dealt with. The hospital says they take them or not. So if you're a policeman and somebody breaks a window in the main street, are you going to bring him here and wait 12 hours? Or are you going to go down to the station and book him? You go down to this is what happens. And police tell me this all the time. I'm sure they tell you. So that has resulted in our jails being chock-a-block with people who really, their crime is that they were born with the wrong genes and developed a serious mental illness. And the jail is not a place for someone with schizophrenia. So that's the backgrounds, where we are, how I think we got there. I've got another talk which goes on much longer about the history of the asylum. But what can we do about it? How can you, as a family member, advocate for a relative who isn't getting services? So, first we need to just think a little bit about who is the patient's psychiatric advocate, because a lot of people claim in one way or another to be that advocate. So is it the patient's psychiatric patient's advocacy office? So we have such an office, as you know. They do great work. Is it psychiatrists? Are the psychiatrists the advocate for the patient? Is it people with lived experience? This is often said, nothing about us without us. Or is it families? Let's look at this a little more. Let's see if I can get back here. So the psychiatric patients, am I going the right way? Yeah. PPO advocates for procedural rights, for legal rights. It's an excellent service. They do a really good job. I mean, I've been working, Marvin was very kind, said I've been working for 25 years. If he was 35 years, he'd still be short of the total. Many of those years in Ontario. And I've once or twice had a problem with the Psychiatric Patients Advocacy Office. They do a great job, but they do not advocate for treatment. If you go and say something's not happening, this person's not getting out because they're not getting treatment, they'll do nothing. Psychiatrists, now I'm one, so I think whatever about the rest of them, you're going to believe me in this, we're not great advocates. Some of my colleagues are, and I'm sure you know some of these colleagues, are wonderful. They really do go that extra mile or extra 10 miles to make sure that their patients get service. They really are. I can't say enough about them. But many others are they're overwhelmed. They're just doing their job, and we work typically with hospitals. We're working for the seriously mentally ill. We've got a hospital appointment, and we've got limited ability to push the hospital. And if we start making a lot of noise, then privileges may not be renewed, etc. So we have to watch our P's and Q's, and when the emergency room is full and the psychiatric ward upstairs is at 110%, we sometimes send people home that shouldn't be sent home. Most individuals, so the nothing about us without us, that's great, but the people with lived experience who are good advocates are people who don't have serious mental illness. I've been at this a long time. I've worked with some great people as advocates who had got schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but they had a terrible time when things got stressful. And I've seen people actually break down in this situation, and they are the rare individuals. So people who don't have psychotic disorders really, in my view, cannot be the final arbitrator of whether we use involuntary treatments on selected occasions under carefully defined situations. And of course, a lot of so-called consumer survivors said that should be banned, and that shows the lack of understanding and care about these individuals. So, unfortunately, from my perspective, the burden of this falls to families. I think in our current situation, families are the group that are most likely to step forward and look after the needs of people with serious illness, most likely to advocate for them. So, what stops families from doing it? Well, I think we have to acknowledge families come in all sorts of different forms. They've got different sets of skills, and advocating isn't a skill that comes naturally. So a lot of families don't have the necessary skills. Some families don't think they have the necessary skills, and they're reluctant to do it. I think this is probably the biggest thing, the burden of stress. So if you've got a really ill relative, it's often parents and son, and it's often the mother who ends up carrying the biggest share of the burden, then it saps all your energy, and it makes it difficult to get into systemic advocacy. And of course, there's pessimism about the likelihood of change. If you run up against a brick wall 3 times, 4 times, typically you're not going to keep on doing that. You're going to back down and just say there must be something wrong with me. I must have got it wrong that my child needs this service, because every time I say it, somebody's saying to me, no, that's not true. Stigma, we heard a bit about today, and this is a really active, live thing. So family members are often given the message that somehow it must be your fault, or they don't want to step up. It's okay to be cutting ribbons and kissing babies when you're opening a neonatal unit. Less so to be pushing for services for people with serious mental illness and acknowledging that you've got serious mental illness in your family. But shockingly, ladies and gentlemen, I've come to realize that a significant concern in many relatives' case is this: the fear of reprisal. I mean, it really took me years. I thought, no, I can't. But I'd asked more and more people, and it's very clear that this stands foremost in the minds of a lot of family members, that if I make a lot of noise, our Johnny won't have a psychiatrist anymore. He won't be admitted. They'll take it out on him when he's admitted. Now, this is one thing. I just want to disabuse you of this notion right here and now. This does not happen. I've watched this closely over years. This doesn't happen. When I have people who are, the family have been very vocal, I mean, I tell the nursing staff, you need to watch your P's and Q's here. This family's, they're going to be watching us. Make sure you do everything correctly. And that's what I see around me. So I would tell you, do not worry about this. It'd be interesting. I see some heads shaking, so Be interested in the question and answer if people have different experience. Okay, so how do you make a complaint? Now you might say, Dr. Riley, surely you're not going to tell us, you're not going to instruct us how to make a complaint. Sure, aren't people complaining too much? They're complaining all the time. I know, Linda, she does nothing but complain. Well, that's my point. Yeah, people are complaining all the time and do nothing but complain. They're not doing it properly, or they're not doing it for the right reason. So the only reason I think to complain is to affect change. And so how do you complain effectively? So first thing is make detailed notes about what's happened. Because you're going to need those details. And on our side, and I'm going to call it our side because I work in the system, we, when somebody comes in a hospital, we have the time, entered at 6:22, seen by Dr. O'Reilly at 7:15. And then the family say, oh, we waited 4 hours before Dr. O'Reilly saw the patient. And, your credibility is gone to hell right at the start. So make careful notes. Who's on? What's the name? What's the name of the doctor? I would discuss the issue with somebody before going forward. I mean, I think when you do something that's potentially going to be a big thing, and you want to do it correctly, this is a sensible thing to do. That used to be one of the roles of the now redesigned Schizophrenia Society. I'm greatly saddened and distressed by the demise of the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario, which was a great partner in the introduction of community treatment orders and expanded criteria to include deterioration in 2000. It was really the Schizophrenia Society and the Ontario Psychiatric Association that made those changes. Okay, so put your complaints in writing and do it in a formal way, and just state the facts, right? You want to get the facts, you record those facts and you state them, okay? Keep emotion out of it. It's not good to be emotional when you're making a complaint. It's showing my age perhaps. It was only 1990, I think, Home Alone. I don't know if people saw Home Alone, but the basic idea is the family fly from Chicago to Paris, I think, and they leave their youngest son behind. And then the mother gets out at Paris, and she's got difficulty with the language. She has to get a phone. She calls the police in Chicago, and she's beside herself. And the first police officer just presses the line, says, "Crazy on line 2, crazy on line 2." You don't want to be a crazy on line 2. So keep emotion out of it. Ask questions rather than make accusations. So it's very tempting. You want to strike back because the system has done a disservice to your relative. But keep the end goal in mind, being effective and getting someone. It's much better to get someone to actually say they're wrong and go through what they're going to do the next time. And make your intentions clear rather than making a threat. Okay? So, how do we get attention? Well, one way we can get attention is copying others. The easiest way to copy others is to use email, but I would caution against using email to make a complaint. I opened my email at 7:45 this morning, and I'm not working today, obviously. There were 25 emails in my box, and there's going to be another 40 or so when I open it tonight. So, I'm moving email out as quickly as I can. I often miss things. I put things into a to-do folder, which sometimes I, don't get to. So I think sending by courier, I don't know if we still have registered post, I think we do. But that gets attention. It's something different. It gets the attention of the clinician. And then go up the line. So typically the person you're going to be first stopping at is the attending physician. Right, so He's the bottom of the line, though. I'm the bottom of the line in that situation. And if you don't get satisfaction from the attending physician, then go to her chief of staff, the next up the line, right? Just go up. And if the chief of staff, say the director of the emergency room or the head of the inpatient service, psychiatrist in chief, if he or she doesn't give you satisfaction, go to the CEO of the hospital. There is a final option. Well, I guess we'll go to the local MPPs. MPP. So yes, and that is a good option. But of course, you can always go to the media. Media, it's okay. It's hospitals certainly don't like the media. I call it the nuclear option. It then does cause people start to really you got public relations officers involved. Everybody's in the bunker. It's like a nuclear weapon. It's a better deterrent. It's better kept in your back pocket as a potential than to actually be used. All right. And but hospitals really they do worry about bad publicity because they're often, they're fundraising, they want their reputation kept, etc. So that threat that somebody might do something in the media is always powerful. But give the hospital a chance. Let them know, you're thinking about it or whatever. You've been talking to a reporter, or and when you go to the media, it's much better if you have the patient. This is just a reality. So I think family members have difficulty sometimes getting attention from the media, but a patient who has a story about not being served well often will get attention. And family organizations can cultivate media. The media is, it's a friendly media. You can meet with reporters, and they want to tell stories and develop a relationship. And then when the time comes, you may have a story, or you may want to push something. So that's well worth doing. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. So I chose an example where somebody goes to the emergency room and isn't admitted. There are other scenarios, of course, where people are discharged prematurely, where there's no follow-up, where people aren't considered for a community treatment order, where people aren't considered for clozapine, the gold standard medication for treatment-resistant schizophrenia. So any of these, we could make, this is boilerplate, it could be drawn up similarly for any other condition. So here it is. Dear Dr. Smith, read John Wilson, date of birth. On July 1st, 2001, I brought my son to the emergency room of the Toronto General Hospital. This is not a slur on the Toronto General Hospital. I had to use some hospital's name. John has an established diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Before bringing him to the emergency room, I called our GP, Dr. William Osler, to ask his advice. Dr. Osler recommended that John be assessed and possibly admitted. Dr. Osler has been prescribing medication for John, but John stopped the medication at least 2 months previously, and Dr. Osler was able to tell us that he confirmed that by calling the pharmacy. Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts, ma'am. But these are powerful facts. Okay, how does it go? John lives with me. In the last 2 weeks, he's become increasingly agitated and has been shouting at invisible people in our home day and night. On the morning of July 1st, 2021, John said that he had to make a sacrifice. Called Dr. Osler, who said correctly that as he hadn't seen John within a week, he couldn't put a certificate on him, but he said that he really needed to be assessed for involuntary hospitalization. Honestly, if I was Dr. Osler, in this case, my response might have been, you need to consider calling the police, because somebody's making this sort of threat. So, but anyway, the parents had a good relationship, and John, so the letter goes on, you saw John at approximately 8:20 on the night of July 1st. Nurse Jennifer Lopez told me that, I told her that I'd wanted to talk to the doctor to fill him in on the details. Despite this request and the supportive role I'm playing in my son's life, I was not given the opportunity to talk to you about my concerns or about your recommendations. Right? This person's saying he needs to make a sacrifice. At 11:30 p.m., I was simply told that John was being sent home and I was not provided with any other information. Sound familiar to anyone? Yeah. I mean, our politicians are here. This happens all the time. All the time. I run a course for family members in our hospital. It's just on the legislation, but we have a question and answer, and it always comes to these sort of scenarios. Always. Since your assessment on July 1st, John has continued to have difficulties, and then July 3rd, 2 days later, he went to the local 7-Eleven and threw all the bottled products on the floor. He was arrested, and he's awaiting trial at the Dawn Jail. Okay. I would appreciate if you could tell me why John was not admitted on that date. I'm not going to read this, but it's a little complex. It goes essentially saying that he meets the criteria for deterioration, okay, that he could have been admitted under the deterioration criteria. That might be a little harder to craft, but honestly, with John, it also seems to me that my son met Box A criteria for dangerousness. In view of John's delusions and past history, a statement that he needs to make a sacrifice indicates that he's a clear possibility of self-harm or serious harm to another person, i.e. me, right, the parents, because who are the people that are most likely to be harmed by people with serious mental illness? It's family members, it's not strangers. Serious violence is uncommon, but much higher among people with serious mental illness, particularly when it's combined with drug use. And families are by far the most likely person to be harmed. So another question. I would appreciate if you would explain why you did not meet with me on July 1st. Not only am I the substitute decision maker and therefore the person who must provide consent for any treatment for my son's schizophrenia, but I have also detailed information of my son's recent and past behaviour. And for example, did you know that he had actually assaulted a store assistant with a pop bottle requiring stitches just 2 years ago? Further, did John tell you that he wanted to make a sacrifice? And these are searching questions. So you can imagine, I'm the physician, I get this letter, maybe it comes by courier, and I see these questions, and I actually didn't know one of these two things. I mean, man, I'm on the defensive, right? I've not copied Dr. Singh, the Chief of the Emergency Services at the Toronto General Hospital, or other administrative staff on this correspondence because I want to talk to you directly and hope we can resolve it. So we don't make a threat, but we clearly signal what our intentions are if we don't get it sorted out. And this can be done for all the other situations, right? And I think an organisation could draw up these. I'd be happy to help with that as sort of a template. So that's the individual advocacy. I'm going to just speak briefly about systematic advocacy. So, and really I've already spoken about it. It's easy for me to say, write that letter. But I know individual family members struggle to do that. That letter is going to drop like a bombshell on the clinical team, and it's going to be effective. But I think that when we had the Schizophrenia Society, it was in a position to help some family members do this, so it's difficult. So we do need systemic advocacy. But who does that? So do we expect the ministry to do that? Well, no, because the ministry, The ministry's got other jobs apart from that. If they want to advocate for something, they just do it, right? They get the money, they do it. What about the Canadian Mental Health Association? I probably need a drink before I go on here, because you can see that this is going to be a problem. So the first thing that I am going to say is that the Canadian Mental Health Association does wonderful work, and I send many of my patients to the Canadian Mental Health Association. And on an individual branch level, some of the branches are superb, the leadership of the branch, and really, fully understand the feelings in the system, the need to prioritise services to the serious mentally ill. But the Canadian Mental Health Association as an organisation in Ontario it's riven with different viewpoints and politics. And when we brought in community treatment orders in 2000, the CMHA was the main opposition. So they dedicated a person to try to prevent the changes in the legislation. And then we were sort of, after a day's work, maybe twice a week, we were calling up and spending an hour, talking between the doctors and, patching in the Schizophrenia Society, trying to counter that. But now the CMHA run community treatment order programs, they run ACT teams. So things have changed, but still those basic tensions are there. So it'll be very difficult to get the CMHA to speak with a strong voice about some things, including the need for very assertive treatment in the community, changes to mental health legislation, etc. What about the Institute of Advancement in Mental Health? Can I take a show of hands? Now, honestly, who has heard of this organisation? 1, 2, 3, including the speaker tree, so we'll have that for the people thing. So this is a disaster. This is a disaster. Actually, the name was chosen, I believe, because it shortens to I am. Like we, right? sorry. I wasn't thinking we're no. But I think the branding is the thing, but yet nobody knows who this organisation are. This is the old Schizophrenia Society of Ontario, a group which had branches all over the province, branches which had regular meeting, which supported families and individuals with schizophrenia, which provided education, which worked on advocacy. And now it's become, I don't know, something that we've never heard of. This is their statement on their website, on one of their initiatives, and it's on public spaces. I'm just going to read a little bit of this. So, at IAM, we explore the way that public space design in our communities can influence well-being. We believe it takes a multidisciplinary approach to tackle designing healthy public places and ultimately healthy cities. It goes on to talk about best practices, guidelines, and says that we believe one that uses and considers mental wellness and social economic determinants of health as critical factors in how we design public spaces and built environments. A holistic approach is the way to go, etc. I actually feel very strongly about this, about public space. I'm not saying that. I think you sort of got the sense of me now. I'm going to tell you what I believe and not tell you any lies, not put any sugar coating on it. This is a big thing to me. And our family, we talked about this over the dinner table as our children were growing up, and I'm delighted that my daughter is now working in urban planning. I mean, because it really does make a difference to how people feel. And, I drive through the outskirts of London, Ontario, or Toronto, and it's a disaster. You can't walk places, you don't feel good, the buildings are terrible. I come from Europe, where cities are mostly pleasant and good places. You can walk, and public transport is much better, and there are green spaces, etc. But, ladies and gentlemen, this has nothing to do with supporting people with schizophrenia and their families. This was the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario, and it's dissolved into this general, I don't know, architectural group. I don't know. They talk on then about installing, one of their projects is to install better lighting because that can actually improve people's well-being. But that's not going to solve the huge problems that we're dealing with in providing service to the serious mentally ill. So, yes, one of my mantras is don't complain if you haven't got a solution. So you just keep it till you get a solution. But I think the solution is not. It's pretty obvious that we need an Ontario organisation. And I actually believe we need a national organisation, because I think the Canadian Schizophrenia Society actually feels to be as active as it should be in promoting some of these needs. Part of the mandate would be to advocate for appropriate services, both at a provincial and individual level. But what might you call this organisation? So you might put the word family into the organisation. I can see a reason to do that. And the Schizophrenia Society was the friends and family of schizophrenia. So once the family was dropped, it left it open to the Schizophrenia Society. Say, no, we're going to move to patient-based, and we're going to de-emphasize the role of families, and then you see what happens. So we could do that, or maybe we could just call it the Ontario Schizophrenia Society. If the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario doesn't like the word schizophrenia, if it thinks that it's the problem, that it's stigmatizing, and that everything will be great when they drop it, maybe we can appropriate it without actually using that name. I actually took a little bit of legal advice about this, not formally, but we did a little bit of research. And I believe that this would be acceptable, and even if you never know what an aggrieved party is going to do. Even if the Institute for Advancements in Mental Health complained, I think that would be a remarkable thing. I'd love to have that publicly, talking about why they dropped the name and then objected to somebody else taking up that name. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Thank you for putting up for my increasingly hoarse voice. It will recover later on to answer questions. I'd be happy to do that, or to hear your thoughts about things. Thank you.
You mentioned why families don't advocate, and one of the words you used was stress. But I think that they're more traumatized. I think trauma is a stronger and more appropriate word to use than stress.
Families are traumatized by the experience of looking after and trying to get appropriate services for their loved ones. And I'm quite happy with that. In a way, trauma is the word du jour. And words change all the time, but I accept that. Certainly, I think part of what you're telling us is that it's not just a little stress, that this is life-changing and all-consuming, and I totally understand that from not experiencing it, but from seeing and working with families. Thank you. The essence of what you're saying is that many people don't get the appropriate services, either because their psychiatrist won't refer them to existing services which need a referral, or maybe even the psychiatrist says we can no longer provide service for your relative. And yes, I think these are regular problems. And as I've said already, I'm not an apologist for psychiatrists. One of my things, I can't say this any stronger. Well, I can actually, and I will. So psychiatrists, like other parts of the system, should serve the people with serious illness first. And if they don't do that, they should be made do that. So it is not acceptable that somebody who needs very close psychiatric care and supervision is left in the hands of the family physician. And there are ways that that people can be forced to do things. It's easy to make a complaint to the college. It probably won't go anywhere because that's the standard of practice. You need to actually say that you can't, do this, that you must provide service, and maybe at a ministerial level. So I was on the executive of the OMA, and I resigned a couple of years ago, and it was because of issues around the number of counselling sessions that somebody could have. So it's unlimited on OHIP. So if you're a patient, you get a psychiatrist and they see some counselling, you can continue to go twice weekly. That is not acceptable to me when we have people who are sent back to their family doctor who need careful monitoring with schizophrenia. I just finished by saying you can use the template I've provided to ask those questions. Here's the facts. Why did you stop seeing my patient? Look at the college website about abandonment. It's an important concept in medicine, and maybe just make a little reference to that. Very, very powerful.
My son, several years back, was more in the manic stages than he is today. He had been playing up for some time and we considered him very dangerous, and we called the ambulance. They ended up taking him up to the Newmarket Hospital, South Lake, I believe it is, and this was 9:10 at night. They took him up there, and we followed in our own car. And we already were ready. We had all our ducks in order, as the doctor said. We have a brown envelope with up-to-date information, his whole history. And we arrived at the hospital behind them. They had already taken him into another room. 2 hours later, at midnight, they let him out. This is February. They let him out. All he had taken was a little sweatshirt, and he's got it hooked over his shoulder, and he walks past us facetiously, and he says, "So we're going home now?" So we said, "What? We haven't been spoken to. We haven't given our side of the story yet. How can they let you go home?" So he says, "If you're not going with me, I'm taking a taxi." And that's exactly what he did. We went to the counter, to the office, and we insisted on seeing the mental health nurse or the doctor who had spoken to him. 2 hours. Nobody came. We stood there and we ranted. Finally, they sent out the mental health nurse who had also been present with him. We stood there and we said, "What are you thinking? Do you not see how ill he is?" "Well, I'm sorry, he's not a danger to himself or a danger to anyone else, and so we have to let him go by law." So we said, but if he goes out there and he causes any kind of damage to himself or any property or anyone else, we will sue the pants off this hospital. We were frantic. We went home. My son disappeared for 10 days. We had the police looking for him through a good friend of ours who happened to be a chaplain there. They found him after he had done damage in several hotels. Started off at the Metropolitan Soho Hotel downtown, $350 a night. I mean, I don't have to tell you where he was thinking. It took a few days being there till the police found him there by following his Visa card. He had just left by 30 minutes when they found him there, and they couldn't find him again till he spent money on his visa again. Finally, he came back up to York Region, and after 10 days, the police found him with a description of the car he had stolen from my other son, his brother's car. He had been to Canadian Tire, bought a can of green spray paint, and thought he would hide the color of the grey car with green. Of course, don't have to tell you what that looked like. They picked up the car in the car park of the Best Western on Highway 7, and they called us to say, could you describe what's in the car? Maybe we found it. And we described what's in the car, and they had found it. They found him in the hotel room, smoking marijuana, smoking cigarettes, and looking shocking. They took him immediately to Markham Stouffville Hospital, where he was a patient, and he was there, I can't remember how many months, till they got him right. But this I blame on the hospital, because they did not, they admit, yes, we know he's sick, we see he's sick, but he's not a danger to himself or anything else, so we are not allowed to keep him. Our hands are tied.
I'm actually, I don't have all the facts in front of me, but I think, based on what you said, that it's possible that he was a danger to himself and perhaps a danger to others. He stole a car and drove. It's not hard for me to imagine that might be recklessly. That's after the fact, but this is what happens when people are in a full-blown manic episode, and also lack of insights and judgment leads people to do things which might inadvertently cause harm to themselves. And the mental health legislation does not require people to form an intent to harm themselves. If they harm themselves because of neglect or poor judgment, if they're likely to harm themselves, they could be certified under that grounds. Plus there's the deterioration criteria. So there are a number of different ways that somebody can be adjudged to need inpatient care. What's happened, of course, is that hospitals have become more busy. The wards are full, and so the standard, the bar to get into hospital has progressively risen. So when I came to Ontario first in 1989, it was not nearly as difficult to get an admission, voluntary or involuntary, and it is now. We had elective admissions in those days. It wasn't difficult for me to organise for one of my patients to go in and get a specific course of treatment, which I felt would be better applied in hospital. But now that's not an option at all. So the level, the test for commitment, although there's nothing in the legislation has changed. In fact, it's got easier, but it's become harder to get in because we don't have beds.
Thank you, Dr. O'Reilly. That resonated very much with me, and I'm sure all of us. So you say that we're afraid of reprisal. Yes, it's true. And it did happen to my son and I. So it does happen. It wasn't necessarily a doctor, but kind of it was. So it was my son, his My son is supported by an organization, and because I spoke up, I do believe that he was compromised, and so was I as his advocate. So since then, the doctor hasn't seen my son in almost 2 years. This is the psychiatrist, because I dared to ask why he hadn't been seen in about 3 or 4 months. And so, because the previous psychiatrist was wonderful, she saw him on a monthly basis, maybe on a monthly or or as needed, okay? But at least once a month or every 2 months. Okay, so that's one thing, it does happen, okay? And the second question is, well, that wasn't a question, but, but this is a question. Can I be part of the Ontario Society of, Ontario Schizophrenic Society? Can I be part of that group? Thank you.
Okay, so That's a very interesting question, and I think that that's really up to families to decide. So, Mr. Ross has mentioned he's known me for a long time. So I've been involved with some political advocacy things that had families and professionals. But I really think, based on my experience and watching the system over the years, that families have to do this. I don't think you can rely on professionals. I'm quite happy to be there to support, that sort of initiative in whatever way I can. But how it comes to be, what it's called, what its mandate is, I think that has to be for family members to decide. Yes, I do. You hear the slight hesitancy in my voice, and that is, I think families would find it difficult on their own. They need to have allies, and we have a history of this with the Schizophrenia Ontario Psychiatric Association and the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario in the 2000 amendments, which were really extensive amendments to the Mental Health Act. So I think that can happen in future.
I work with families from actually all around Ontario, but also internationally, because people are getting my name. And so I'm working on the Terrace Foundation, and they're looking for clozapine experts on schizophrenia. Now, everywhere in the world, there are experts who understand how to administer clozapine. We are the only country that does not have an expert. So now I've become the expert on clozapine, which I've studied and I know a lot about it, but I don't think I'm the expert. So I have contacted scientists at CAMH, at Toronto General, at like all the major hospitals in Toronto, and not one psychiatrist will put their name to be on that board. Can you help me get some names to be on that board?
Yeah, I can certainly suggest a couple of people in there. Clozapine is great medication. It's underutilized, unfortunately. It could really transform, I think, people's lives. It's difficult to use. It's a drug that has to be used carefully. We have some very experienced people in London, Ontario, for example, but there are other people. Have you approached the Ontario Psychiatric Association?
No, I've done CAMH, Mass program.
Sure, I'll give you some names, and I would approach the Ontario Psychiatric Association because they will know people through the province.
Okay, and just one last thing. Lastly, there's a group of families that are having trouble finding help and getting the right medications, and they're not being optimized or stabilized. And so a group of families want to go to the U.S., and they're looking at places in Arizona and the McLean Hospital, but they're thousands of dollars. Do you know if you can't get the right treatment in Canada, would the OHIP or would the Ontario Psychiatric Association endorse families, help them to get to the right treatment that is not available in Canada?
So I certainly know that's that's not an option that the Ontario Psychiatric Association would be within their remit to help you with, because they do not determine who receives OHIP. So it's really a matter for the ministry. A lot of people, I don't keep up with this as well as perhaps I should, but I know a lot of Ontario citizens have received addiction treatments in facilities in the US. I suspect that is continuing, but I'm not sure. But my understanding is you need to get pre-approval, and of course that would be just in terms of the amount of money that's involved. That would be absolutely essential that you get pre-approval from OHIP to receive service in the US.
Okay, so I think that it's appropriate at this time that I thank Dr. O'Reilly for coming here and affirming all of our experiences and suggesting means in which we can advocate, and I think we'll use your template. I don't know how to say this. I just feel that your lecture today was absolutely invaluable. I can see Maggie there smiling. You know, like I think there's a lot of parents in this room that have been through experiences that they really should not have been through, and it's because of many, many reasons. But I think, Dr. O'Reilly, you sort of laid out a strategy for us, and I think we really need to follow through. So thank you so much for coming. We really, really appreciate it.